From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The bill couldn't even clear committee. Welcome to the Friday edition as President Trump's big, beautiful bill fails to pass the Budget Committee in the House. And now the entire timeline is being thrown into question. I'm Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington. Thanks for being with us on the Friday edition of Balance of Power. Kailey, a big point of disagreement remains lifting the cap on salt, so not a lot has changed since this time yesterday.
Yeah, there's still many who want the salt cap lifted even higher than $30,000, but then there's also fiscal conservatives who want to see the cost-saving measures kick in earlier when it comes to Medicaid work requirements, rolling back measures in the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's those fiscal conservatives that actually took things down in the Budget Committee today. And what was supposed to just be procedure. This committee doesn't have power to change the legislation, and yet it tanked anyway. A
procedural vote, essentially assembling the pieces of this bill. We saw a number of Republicans, to your point, from the Freedom Caucus, a la Chip Roy, Ralph Norman, and so on, voting with Democrats. And I suspect that their phones will be ringing today as President Trump makes his way back from the Middle East.
Yeah, keeping in mind that the president took to True Social today talking about how he wants Republicans to unite behind this one big, beautiful bill. But certainly you're seeing a degree of lack of unity, shall we say, on Capitol Hill right now. And that is actually where we go now live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. As joining us is Republican Congressman Nick LaLota, who represents New York's 1st Congressional District. He, of course, is in the SALT caucus and is one of the members who has been advocating for a higher cap. Congressman, welcome back to Balance of Power. Obviously, there are you and your colleagues who are pushing for a higher SALT cap up against some of these fiscal conservatives who worry what that does to the ultimate price tag. Is there a world here in which those who shot things down in the Budget Committee can get what they want and you get what you want too, or does someone have to lose in this equation?
Yeah, I'm comfortable we're going to land this plane. Ultimately, we all support the concepts behind the one big, beautiful bill. We all want a stronger border security when we want to put the nation on a better fiscal track. And there's some other priorities in there as well that are really important. Energy dominance, really important to the House Republican Conference. We've met other deadlines in the past about, responsibly raising debt ceilings, ensuring the government was funded, doing things responsibly like that under a deadline. I hope that we could do that again this time. This one big, beautiful bill has a couple of warts on it, but I think that we can work through that in order to get it passed ultimately.
Well, Congressman, it's good to have you back. I know you weren't happy with the level that was coming out of the Ways and Means Committee when it came to lifting the cap on salt. So are you actually encouraged by what happened in the Budget Committee today, or are you concerned about the way forward?
Well, it just recognizes the obvious. There are numerous factions within the conference who are displeased with different aspects of the bill. SALT, of course, has gotten a lot of coverage, but there are folks in the conference who are concerned about SNAP, about Medicaid, and, of course, the deficit hawks have their concerns. So there are a couple of things holding this bill up. I hope that we get to yes, but with respect to SALT is a pay-for. The bill as written right now from 2017 has the SALT cap expiring at the end of the year and going back to unlimited. And unlimited SALT over the next 10 years is valued at $1.3 trillion. And that's what's going to happen if no bill passes and if folks like me vote no and others vote no, and ultimately we don't extend those tax cuts. So I think the onus is on others to meet us a little bit in the middle. $1.3 trillion is a lot to incentivize some other great provisions in the one big, beautiful bill. The president's priorities on no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security, the AMT fix, the lower individual rates, the lower business rates. My constituents want all of that, but we don't want to have to pay for the bill again like we paid in 2017. We want a little more fairness this time around.
Well, and Congressman, when you joined us a few days ago, you told us that this idea of a $40,000 SALT cap for individuals and $80,000 for married couples hadn't been explicitly put on the table, that it was something that was obviously in this discussion. Have you gotten an explicit offer for a higher SALT cap, or is that something you're expecting this weekend? Where do things stand?
Yeah, that 40-80 dynamic unfortunately had a poison pill in it, in that there was 40-80 for 4 or 5 years, and it dropped way down to 10 again for the next 5 or 6 years. That, unfortunately, is a gimmick. It's a scam. It just perpetuates the very thing my constituents and I are opposed to right now, this absurdly low 10K cap. That was really just a used car salesman trick that we didn't fall for. We're going to continue to negotiate in good faith to make sure that New Yorkers, New Jerseyans, and Californians get their fair share, because each of us are donor states. Each of our states' taxpayers send way more to Washington than we get back. New York gets about 91 cents for every dollar it sends to Washington, while Missouri, home state to the tax committee chairman, gets $1.60, and Louisiana, home state to the speaker, gets $1.78. So we're not looking for a handout. We're just looking for a fair share and an honest negotiation on how we can move this ball forward.
Well, I know this is a big issue for you. It's something you're passionate about. Congressmen and members of the New York delegation have been strident in their rhetoric in some cases. Would you be willing to vote no on this whole thing if it meant just eliminating the cap altogether, if you can't come to terms on the rest?
If it eliminates the cap altogether, heck, count me in. Let's book it as a yes and let's move on, if that's your question.
No, I mean, would you vote no if it meant allowing that to reset to zero?
Oh, to have no deductibility on the state and local taxes whatsoever?
To eliminate the cap. To go back to where we were before 2017.
That would do it for me. Count me in if we eliminate the cap.
But would you vote no to get there?
Sorry, I don't understand your question. No, I would vote yes on a bill that eliminates the cap. Right now, the cap is $10,000. They're offering $30,000. Yeah. If they offer unlimited, count me in. Let's go. Let's make America great again.
There's a chance this bill might not pass, though, according to some congressmen. You may not see it that way. If this whole thing falls apart, does that help you enough in New York to eliminate this cap to put up with not having the Trump tax cuts?
No, so here's how the negotiations is going to go. If it falls apart, if the bill falls apart in the next couple of days, weeks, or month, everybody's going to rush back to the negotiating table and say, how can we salvage this? And at that point in time, the reality will be apparent to everybody else that what is on the table at that point in time is unlimited SALT. And then we can negotiate down from unlimited rather than up from $10,000. Now, I don't want to get there, but that's the negotiating reality. As the president would say, we have a lot of the cards in this negotiation, but we want to be professionals, we want to be gentlemen about this, and we want to do what's right for the nation. But at the end of the day, you can't stick the blue states with the bill for everybody else's tax incentives like what happened in 2017. The political dynamic is much different this time around. These blue state Republicans like Lawler and Kim and others and Tom Kaine made our majority, and we can't sell them out to pay for and fund the rest of the tax cuts. We have to ensure there's some equity in this bill, and we acknowledge those realities. We'll get to yes. We need to get the president's agenda through. We need to have those overall great tax incentives for America. The negotiations will continue through both in person, over the phone, and on text this weekend, and we'll ultimately get there.
Well, of course, even if you can get there in the House, it then goes to the Senate, Congressman. And what you're describing, the fact that there are Republican members from blue states in the House, is not an issue in the U.S. Senate. Are you concerned that the Senate might actually reduce back a higher SALT cap you fought for, or look at some of the pay-fors that have been suggested, whether it's Medicaid or rollbacks to the Inflation Reduction Act, make them go away, and then you have a new problem in the House again when it comes to the total tally?
Yeah, so maybe we should invite you to our negotiating team, because those are the things that we're talking about right now. We want to ensure that if we do a deal here in the House, it's a deal that will be ratified by both the Senate and the president. So while we're having these discussions on the House side right here, contemporaneous, we want to have some assurances from others who are participating in this one big, beautiful bill. They too will ratify exactly the deal that we come to in the House. That's an important measure. We don't want to just take a vote for the sake of taking a vote here in the House and have our provisions die in the Senate. So what we negotiate here before we get to a yes here has to be assured that it'll pass the Senate and be signed by the president.
So how's it going to work this weekend, Congressman? Bring us behind the scenes, if you would. Are there a series of meetings planned? You mentioned phone calls and texts. Maybe you're going to get a phone call from President Trump, but will you be on Capitol Hill? Will you be working in committee rooms, or how does it come together on a Saturday and a Sunday with a deadline that you're facing?
So the House is not in session. Many of my colleagues went home yesterday, but as you can see from behind me, I'm still here on Capitol Hill, eager to make this deal work. I will continue to collaborate with not just members of the SALT caucus, but those who see this issue differently than me. Happy to work together, and as a conference, as a House Republican conference, we've gotten through and over hurdles like this in the past. I expect my colleagues from the upper chamber to work in good faith as well, and certainly the president wants to get this across the finish line. It is worthy of the nation's attention, is worthy to that we work over the weekend and through the night, talk, text, in person, whatever it takes, Zoom. We'll continue to keep the door open and keep the dialogue going to get this one big, beautiful bill passed.
And are these negotiations going to be bilateral, if you will, between the Speaker's office and the SALT caucus, or are you going to have to include members of the Freedom Caucus like Chip Roy and Ralph Norman, who obviously are the ones that helped take this thing in the budget in the first place? Are these trilateral negotiations?
Yeah, I think this is going to be an all-hands-on-deck effort, as it's been in the last couple of days, especially. We had a meeting yesterday in the Speaker's office with members of the Republican conference whose politics are much different. We had folks in there whose districts Trump won by 50, and those who Harris won by 3, 4, or 5. People with different constituencies, different priorities, different views of the world. I think it's important that we continue to talk with each other. I've been talking and texting with some of those folks here who come from some of those deep red districts. You know, we all have to come together at the end of the day to put this nation on a better track. You know, we're a nation $36 trillion in debt, $2 trillion deficit. A lot of folks are living paycheck to paycheck. They're eager to see Washington Republicans come together to ensure that we have a tax bill, an overall spending bill that's best for our country, and we'll work with each other regardless of political persuasion to ensure that gets done.
Really important conversation, Congressman. We really appreciate your being with us shortly after the Budget Committee vote. That's Nick LaLota with a working weekend ahead, as you just heard, the Republican from New York. We thank you, as always, for joining here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We want to add the voice of Laura Davison, our Deputy Bureau Chief here in Washington, D.C., and one of our political team leaders. Laura, it's great to see you. What you just heard from the gentleman from New York, we're going to stay the weekend. We're going to keep working on this. Sounds just like Chip Roy. I'm staying in Washington this weekend to deliver. How about we get these two together to figure it out?
It certainly seems like this bill is not advancing at the rate that House Speaker Mike Johnson wants. This, this sort of stunning defeat in the Budget Committee. That doesn't happen. This is really a procedural rubber stamp effort, and the fact that the bill went to committee knowing that it didn't have the votes and then failed indicates that there are serious issues that could really threaten the chances of this bill passing the House next week, as Mike Johnson has wanted. The House then is at least scheduled to recess for 2 weeks, means that it wouldn't be until mid-June that they pick this back up. I think we could see a lot of schedule changing in the House if it looks like things are falling back, as Representative LaLota just said. If things, if fall apart in the next couple of days, you expect to see people rushing back to the negotiating table to figure out how to salvage the Medicaid issue, the SALT issue, the spending issue. All of this is of deep concern.
Well, and of course, it's not just of deep concern for Speaker Johnson, who wants to get this done, but for President Trump, too. When you have the president taking to True Social saying that we don't need grandstanders in the Republican Party, stop talking and get it done, saying Republicans must unite behind the one big beautiful bill, and then hours later, 5 Republicans, although one was just for procedural reasons, 4 Republicans really in the Budget Committee decide to specifically not advance the president's bill. What does that signal about his power in all of this?
It signals that he doesn't have the ability to keep this party together. That's been his superpower through all of this, is that he's been able to put out a tweet saying people, hey, fall in line, and they have. Right now, that is not the case that's happening. It's clear the president is very frustrated with this process. That Truth Social post you just read, that was in a series of a long list of angry posts from the president this morning.
Including about
everything.
Taylor Swift.
He was clearly angry about a lot of things, from pop culture to budget reconciliation. I think that covers the full gamut. But this is clear that that he has kind of from the top of this negotiation said, look, get it done. I don't really care how you do it, but just make sure these tax cut bills pass. As tariffs continue to percolate, you have people like Walmart coming out saying prices are going to rise. That's even more mounting pressure on the White House to get a tax bill done, and quickly.
I want to go back to where you started here, Laura. And first of all, the rarity of a bill failing in committee like this, I mean, it's a little bit of egg on face, I'm assuming, for the chair, unless Jody Arrington was trying to make a point. But also what this means potentially for the long-term status of this bill. Are we making too much of this to suggest that this whole thing could fall apart, or it's simply about getting everyone back in a room and coming up with a plan B?
Those are sort of the two options here. One, this may be a small blip, and in a couple days they've ironed out these details. They had that little bit of a public embarrassing moment and decide, okay, let's move forward with unity. it could also mean that this is just, sort of the signs of deeper troubles to come. I'll also note that you have senators already coming out, Republican senators saying that they won't support this bill, they can't support this bill. There's going to need to be big changes, scaling back some of these Medicaid cuts. That's something that House members are thinking about, particularly moderates. They don't want to have to take a tough vote on a bill that really scales back something that may be unpopular in their district, and then have that totally rewritten by the Senate. So you're seeing a lot of political considerations, not just between House Republicans, but also between House and Senate Republicans, of what is a bill that can get 50, the 51, 50 in the Senate and 218 in the House. That's not an easy feat.
Well, and when you talk about Medicaid cuts in particular, obviously for Chip Roy and co., that is part of their problem, is these new rules around work requirements, for example, aren't supposed to kick in for several more years. They would like to see it kicking in sooner. Was there a reason that this wasn't supposed to happen until 2029? Are they trying to get around issues potentially in the midterms until changes are made? Why wouldn't they have just done it from the jump?
The reason is why these tax cuts are set to expire. You put all the juicy stuff, the stuff that people like at the beginning, and you put the tough stuff at the end of the budget window. So 2029, I'll note that's when after the 2028 presidential election, after the midterms, the stuff that people aren't going to like and are going to feel the impacts of, that's a future Congress's problem. And it also gives this Congress a lot of time to potentially repeal that if you want to. There's a lot of things we've seen Congress do this time and time again. If they have to do something unpopular, they have to make a decision to raise some revenue. They'll put that in the future, and then that's a problem for another day.
Well, we've seen Donald Trump flip votes before. One of these no votes came from Ralph Norman. He got a phone call from Donald Trump last time the speaker's a job was at risk, and about 10 minutes later, he got off the cell phone and changed his vote. Could we see something along those lines? We
very much could. Trump is clearly whipping this bill himself, though both in public as well as in private, making calls to members. He wants to get this done. It's interesting to see, though, how many people are willing to buck him on this is supposed to be Republicans' signature legislative achievement, and it's not clear right now that they can do that.
Well, and when we consider that, and to come back to the idea that the midterms are next year, is this House conservative saying, okay, we're probably going to lose the House in 2026, therefore we need to make this exactly what we want now. This is our last chance to actually do something more dramatic when it comes to debt and deficits, and basically saying the majority is going to be lost anyway, or that they still think they can walk this hard line and retain the majority in 2026.
That's what they're publicly saying, but privately, House Republicans know that there's a very strong chance that they could lose the chamber. That's just kind of the tradition. History suggests that's very much a possibility. But this is where the tension is. You have the hardliners saying, let's get everything that we can get done right now, and you have the moderates, people who want SALT, and others saying, don't cut Medicaid for my district. I need to expand SALT. Those are the things I need to get reelected. And the only way you, House Republicans, have a majority is if we have these districts around New York, in Southern California. So you have two sort of very much competing visions at odds here.
President Trump, on his way back from Abu Dhabi today, saw quite a number of posts on social media, as you guys suggested. We only had this one, the Taylor Swift post. The President of the United States. Has anyone noticed that since I said I hate Taylor Swift, she's no longer hot? What's going on that airplane?
It's Trump coming down from the high that he had in the Middle East. He was showered with praise. He had horses. There were dancers. There were, the whole spectacle. And, he also didn't get a lot of sleep. He went very late every single night.
Wow.
One colleague mentioned it's like when your child has a sleepover, comes home, had all sorts of fun, doesn't get any sleep, and then suddenly they're cranky and in a bad mood the next day.
I just want to know what he saw.
Who was he talking to?
Did someone start playing Taylor Swift on Air Force One?
It's a great question.
Where did it come from?
Taylor was in the air.
We'll have to wait for answers for another day, perhaps. Laura Davison, Washington Deputy Bureau Chief for us here at Bloomberg, with us on Balance of Power. So I guess she's no longer hot?
That's what he says.
News to me.
You'd know this more than I.
I'm still a fan.
I guess so. Maybe we'll play that to the panel next. We've got a good one today.
Yes.
Roger Fisk, Lisa Camooso Miller, their take on a breaking news day here in Washington. We'll have a lot more straight ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kailey, Leinz. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg. Right, Charlie, thank you so much. Live from New York, Charlie Pellet, watching Wall Street for us every day here on Balance of Power. We'll get back to Charlie shortly to check back in on the Friday trade with breaking news midday here in Washington. The headline on the terminal says it all. Trump tax cuts fail in House panel as GOP divided on bill cost. Panel being the key word there. The bill couldn't even clear the Budget Committee. Expected to be a rubber stamp, a procedural vote today that would then lead to a floor vote next week. But there are many holdouts here, beginning in the Freedom Caucus, where a number of Republicans voted with Democrats to sink the bill, as noted by Budget Committee Chair Jody Arrington a short time ago.
Well, the noes have it. The committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair. I want to thank everybody for their time and patience, and Godspeed and safe travels.
That gavel was not the happiest gavel you've
safe travels
ever seen, as everyone heads to the airport, although I guess not everyone, maybe many members of the Budget Committee, but not some of the ones who voted no in committee today. Congressman Chip Roy, for example, says he intends to stay the weekend. We just spoke with a member of the SALT caucus, Republican Congressman Nick LaLota of New York. He and his SALT colleagues also intend to be here for continued negotiations. They're going to try to work through this, and maybe we'll be in a different place come Monday. But remember, Monday was the day that this was supposed to be before the Rules Committee, the last hurdle to getting this to the House floor. So the timeline is now very much in question.
Yeah, it's throwing big questions into the timeline, and of course just the veracity of this bill to begin with. As we discussed with Laura Davison, there are real concerns about whether they can get this done at all in its current form, whether it's one big beautiful bill or maybe it's a couple of different bills that might require a few swings at tax cuts, the debt ceiling, say SALT, and the rest.
Yeah, remember when that's what the Senate wanted?
That's interesting.
The House fought for one bill.
Oh, true.
And one bill is proving to be kind of problematic. So let's get into this now with our political panel. Lisa Camooso Miller is with us, Republican strategist, former RNC communications director. And Roger Fisk is with us as well, Democratic strategist and former special advisor to President Barack Obama. Welcome to you both. Lisa, obviously this went down in budget today, which was a bit surprising. But I would also note that two of the kind of ringleaders here, Congressman Chip Roy and Congressman Ralph Norman, are also on the Rules Committee. If it wasn't going to fail today necessarily, would it not have failed on Monday?
No question it would have failed on Monday, but this is a precursor to what we're looking at, right? And I want to know if Godspeed and safe travels means something like bless your heart in the South, because I'm a kid from the SALT caucus, right? But to me, the chairman did not seem happy. He has also been very, very measured in the way he's talked about this particular bill. I think they knew going in that there were a lot of holdouts from the Freedom Caucus. They knew that there was going to be trouble here. I don't think that they thought that this was a rubber stamp, but they did go in hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could cross this hurdle and then get to Monday for another fight. And in fact, in Washington, D.C., there's nothing worse than the threat of having to stay in town. And it sounds like everybody who's got a dog in this fight is sticking around and staying around for takeout.
I think that's great. Washington's lovely on the weekends, often because the lawmakers are all gone and you can go anywhere you want. Roger, everyone's angry. No one's agreeing on anything, just like yesterday, just like last week, just like a month ago. Why would that be different come Monday?
Well, I'm not angry. I'm thrilled to be here with you and Kailey and Lisa. And I agree with Lisa's analysis that we're going to see more problems when it gets over to the Rules Committee, even if it even does. I was just reflecting on, if you're a frontline Republican and you're getting very clear signs from an unlikely source like a Josh Hawley in the Senate that they're not down with big Medicaid cuts, why would you take that vote now, knowing that it's going to go over to the Senate and it's going to come back, you're going to have to vote on it after it's in conference, without the Medicaid cuts that you are now going to have to take a vote on? Your fingerprints are going to be on it as you head into a difficult reelection. So you can understand the logic for a frontline Republican to just back off at this point. So then, in a sense, you actually have some commonality between the Freedom Caucus and some of the SALT states, because the SALT Republicans don't necessarily want to own those Medicaid cuts going into a tough fight. And the Freedom Caucus philosophically doesn't want to spend more money. So the fact that these signals are coming from the Senate almost gives some license or some comfort to people to even distance themselves even more from this very, very big bill that goes in way too many directions at the same time. Very similar to what we saw with the Biden administration and the Build Back Better. It was just too big. And look at what happened when they broke it up. They broke it up so that infrastructure stood on its own. They actually got 12 Republican votes for that, and all 12 of those Republicans were reelected. So when these big bills get actually spliced into smaller bills, it can actually work better. But the spectacle that we all know the president wants to have come from this, the big beautiful bill, is looking very crippled at this point, and I can't see how they can get this back on track. The speaker can make some adjustments on the calendar, move up the work requirements from 29 to 28 and things like that. but it's going to be very difficult. And, I highly doubt that we're going to see this moving on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday.
Roger, Lisa, Kailey, look at this. We're just now hearing from President Trump. We want to bring you to Air Force One. The president is talking right now to reporters at the back of the jet. This is live on Bloomberg.
When you look at the sanctions, these were really brutal. And they would have, I would say, zero chance of success. And this way they have a chance. Their leader's a strong person, but young and a lot of energy and wants to do a good job.
Mr. President, the IDF was planning to send in tens of thousands of more troops and expand the war in Gaza, especially if there wasn't a ceasefire while you were here. Do you support that?
Well, we're going to see what happens. I think a lot of good things are going to happen over the next month, and we're going to see. We have to help also out the Palestinians. A lot of people are starving on Gaza, so we have to look at both sides. But we're going to do a good job. We're very happy with what happened with, I hope it continues, and I think it will, but what happens with India and Pakistan, that was a big success. If you would have seen the level of anger between the two, that was not a good thing, yes.
A senior Hamas leader said that they might be willing to give up power, an Egyptian proposal, in order to bring peace. Is that a step that you
we're going to look at everything, but we want to get the hostages back. I've gotten them, a big majority back, but we want to get the hostages back. So we'll see how that works out. Okay?
Mr. President, are you planning to call Vladimir Putin? How do you think you can get those talks on track?
We have to meet. He and I will meet. I think we'll solve it, or maybe not, but at least we'll know. And if we don't solve it, it'll be very interesting.
And then did Austin Tice come up when you talked to the Syrian president?
I always talk about Austin Tice. Now, Austin Tice hasn't been seen in many, many years. You know that. He's got a great mother who's just working so hard to find her boy. So I understand it. But Austin has not been seen in many, many years.
You were joking about the endurance that it takes to do this. This was a lot to do in a short period of time. Conversations about endurance often focus now on Joe Biden and his endurance and his abilities. The Hur tapes right now, there's a lot of discussion about it. When will they be released? Will you release them? How soon?
Well, I haven't looked into that. That's up to Pam and the group. I haven't really looked into it. Look, everybody understands the condition of him. I know people that are 89, 90, 92, 93 years old that are literally perfect. But Joe was not one of them. And they did a lot of hiding. They were really playing games. And, you can't do that. Our country's at stake. You see, even a thing like this, there's so many decisions for billions and billions, but then you have even more important decisions. You have decisions for life. And you can't have a man in that condition. And everybody was holding back, including the press, including the media.
So you're welcoming white South Afrikaners into the country as refugees when you've closed off that door to a lot of other refugees from other parts of the world. What message does that send to those who say it isn't? Why is that fair?
Well, I think if I see people in distress, I don't care what color, what they look like, what anything, their size, their height, their eyes, I don't care. But I think that from all evidence, the farmers in South Africa are being treated brutally. And it's been reported, and nobody wants to cover it. But they happen to be white, and if they were black, I'd do the exact same thing. And we treat people very well when we see there's a genocide going on. So if it's a genocide, that's terrible, and I happen to believe it could very well be. South Africa's out of control, and it's been out of control for a long time, and the media doesn't report it. And I'm not looking for reporting because, believe me, it's easier for me not to do anything. It's a lot easier because I don't get nasty questions like that. But the fact is that we're about saving lives, and we're going to do that. So we've made a home, and we'll make a home for other people that are treated badly, no matter what their color.
Will you go to the G20? Will you go to the G20 there?
I'm not sure.
Not sure.
I'm really not
on
sure.
Iran, has the U.S. given them a formal proposal? Has Steve Witkoff handed that over?
Yeah, they have a proposal, but more importantly, they know they have to move quickly. Something bad's going to happen. Thank you very much.
How's Tiffany doing? She's well. Everybody's good.
Congratulations on your grandson.
Travel safe, sir.
All right, there you have it from earlier today on Air Force One. Not focused on what took place today on Capitol Hill because that was playback from a short time ago, but wanted to bring you the conversation between President Trump and reporters on the jet. Getting back to our breaking story, though it took place more than an hour ago here in Washington, the Budget Committee failing to pass the the bill, the tax and spend bill that we've spent so much time talking about, including the extension of the Trump tax cuts, the lifting of the SALT cap, and so much more. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz. We want to thank Lisa Camooso Miller and Roger Fisk, our great panel today, Kailey, with so many questions about the way forward on Capitol Hill, not to mention the many questions that the president was being asked about his trip abroad.
Yeah, of course, the president going to return to Washington with quite a conundrum in the legislative branch and trying to advance his agenda, which he posted on True Social about is so important, wanting to see Republicans united on this. And it'll be interesting to see whether he uses the telephone on Air Force One or otherwise this weekend to try to wrestle some members in line here. I was struck by what Lisa said, though, before we went to that tape about this notion that we knew going into the Budget Committee hearing today that there were outstanding issues, that members were not happy. And they went anyway and took the vote anyway and let it fail. This is a kind of repeating pattern with Republican leadership in this House of Representatives.
So was the chairman trying to send a message to the White House that we're not there yet?
Perhaps.
The Rules Committee vote on Monday, to your point, would have gone exactly the same way. It's the same lawmakers on the panel.
Yep, Chip Roy and Ralph Norman are the ones who are perhaps described as troublemakers here, or grandstanders, if you use the word of President Trump. We'll have more on this still ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg. All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. I'm indeed Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where President Trump is making his return to as we speak from his trip to the Middle East. He's stopping to refuel in the UK, going to be landing at Joint Base Andrews later this evening, returning to D.C. at the end of this trip, despite yesterday even suggesting it was unclear what his destination would be after leaving the United Arab Emirates, because he was still leaving the door open to potentially making a stop in Turkey, where negotiations took place today between Russia and Ukraine. Actually, direct talks between the two for the first time in more than 3 years, though it wasn't at the principal kind of senior level that would have drawn President Trump himself.
Far from. That's true. President Zelensky was elsewhere in Turkey. He was also he said he'd be waiting for Putin. And, of course, Vladimir Putin did not show up. Interesting, though, I think the comment from Donald Trump was, if it's appropriate, and clearly he didn't find that to be the case. But we want to dig into this with Nick Wadhams, who helps to run our national security coverage here in Washington at Bloomberg. Nick, it's great to see you. The significance of these talks, as Kailey said, first time in more than 3 years. But I think I overheard someone say earlier, on the Russian side, only the interns showed up. How important was this meeting?
Well, I have differing views on that. I mean, there was a prisoner swap, about 1,000 people. So for them, it'll certainly be very important, though Russia and Ukraine have done a lot of prisoner swaps over the last few years. I mean, you can see it a couple ways. One is at a small step toward what President Trump wants, which is that direct meeting with Vladimir Putin. I think for the Europeans in Ukraine, they do see it as quite significant, because for them it basically flushes Putin out. You know, the question is, does he actually want to commit to a ceasefire? Is he committed to the idea of negotiations leading toward peace? They would point to this meeting and say, no, look, he's not serious about it. Then they can go back to President Trump and say, hey, look, Putin's not serious about this. Let's get on with those sanctions and really put the squeeze on him. The big question, of course, is whether President Trump gets that message. So far, we have no indication that he's willing to take that step with sanctions.
Well, and President Trump said himself that no deal is ever going to happen until he meets with Vladimir Putin, not Zelensky. It needs to be Trump-Putin first, is the thinking of this administration?
Yes. He believes, I mean, this goes back a long time, that the president believes if he can get in the room with Vladimir Putin, he can do the deal. I mean, which is, you could make the argument, but we've been here before, most notably with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, where they had a big meeting in Hanoi in the first term, and President Trump walked away. He didn't get what he wanted, and he walked away, and that situation has been completely unresolved. So, you know, that is certainly his wish. Europeans are terrified of the idea, because if you get the two of them alone in a room together, who knows what concessions President Trump would be willing to make.
The fact that Marco Rubio was there, that Steve Witkoff was there, suggests the U.S. is more serious about this than Russia?
Well, potentially, though. I think what you saw there was Rubio and Witkoff going in part as a way of supporting Ukraine and support, basically a show of support to the European allies as well. I mean, there was so much back and forth trying to figure out, will Trump go, won't Trump go, who's coming from the Russian side. You had Marco Rubio commit to this meeting, and then there was sort of a sense that he couldn't really unwind that once he had committed. I mean, President Trump had also announced that Rubio was going when he was in the Middle East. So Rubio didn't really have much choice. But, I mean, extraordinary comments from Rubio on the way there where he was basically like, listen, I don't think anything's going to come of this meeting, echoing what Trump had said. But you really saw there how low his expectations were for a breakthrough.
Well, so then it begs the question, if we continue to not see much forward progress, what is the U.S. or what are other allies willing to do next? Right. We saw a post on X from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who spoke with Chancellor Merz from Germany, President Macron, Starmer, Donald Tusk, all in this meeting. He says, our position, if the Russians reject a full and unconditional ceasefire and an end to killings, tough sanctions must follow. Are we getting closer to the moment where this administration is willing to put tougher sanctions on Russia, and what would that look like?
Well, the two very big questions there. I think we are getting a little closer, in part because the president's also coming under pressure from the Hill. Lindsey Graham and more than 70 senators from both sides of the aisle are behind a very tough sanctions package. So that is certainly a possibility. The big question, of course, is what would those sanctions look like? When we talk about sanctions, it's always like, oh, there's going to be this big hammer that's going to drop and it's going to change Putin's calculus. Russia has been under sanctions for a very long time, well over a decade, and then we got ratcheted up even more after the invasion, and his calculus has not changed. So the big question is, do they go after oil? Do you go after Lukoil, Rosneft? Do you accept possibility that oil is going to get more expensive, maybe by another $10 a barrel or something like that? So that's going to be the question that President Trump is going to have to answer. And so far, aside from a couple social media posts, he has been mum. And Marco Rubio has also been quiet about this. So the administration really holding its cards close to the vest right now.
All right, Nick Wadhams, who leads our national security coverage here in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power, where we add the voice now of Kailey Grieco, senior fellow with the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program, with us once again on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kailey, it then becomes a question with what Nick was just describing about sanctions not necessarily being something that has shown the power to break the will of Russia and specifically Vladimir Putin. It becomes a question of what does change Putin's calculus. And I do wonder if militarily, when we consider the Russians' position currently in Ukraine in regard to its forces and capabilities, does he have a military incentive at this time to be considering a ceasefire? Or does he have every reason to believe he could keep going at the current pace?
Yes, I mean, I think you're asking exactly the right question, which is if you're going to ultimately get a deal and negotiate, both sides have to decide that they're better off taking a deal than continuing to fight this on the battlefield. And we do have, I think, a number of signs now that it seems Putin thinks that he may be better off fighting this on the battlefield, or at least making one last big push this summer with another offensive to see how much more territory he can physically take. And so my sense is that's probably what's going on here, is he wants to see what else he can accomplish on the battlefield, and then he might be more open to negotiations.
What are we sending at this point, Kailey, to Ukraine in terms of military hardware, in terms of, I guess, logistical support, or is the spigot beginning to run dry? When is Ukraine on its own?
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the big announcements about 2 weeks ago was that we were sending more air defenses. That came out of, around the same time as the mineral agreement was signed with Ukraine. So that I think is quite important, because that's one area where the United States is one of the only countries that can provide like Patriot interceptors that Ukraine needs. The other thing we know is that we're continuing to provide a lot of intelligence support. That's being done through European Command and NATO. That's really critical, even though we don't see it. It helps them a lot with targeting. But the real issue here becomes that the funding is, nearly out for providing additional aid. So the question then becomes whether Congress is going to authorize a new package. And, based on last time, there would be reasons to think that that's going to be really hard to do. And I think a lot will depend probably on whether Trump is still thinking that he can make a deal with Putin, or if he starts to become so frustrated with them that he decides to sort of ratchet up some of the pressure on Putin and maybe support some kind of package.
Well, as we consider both sides' positions here, and to your point about Putin perhaps thinking he might have a better hand here if he continues to pursue this war on the ground, we understand that the Russian delegation was demanding in talks today control of 5 Ukrainian regions, inclusive of Crimea, but also looking at Zaporizhia, for example, Donetsk, the kind of regions where we're familiar with that they've been jockeying for control of. Do the Russians have the controlling position in all of these areas right now, or is there still a chance that Ukraine can regain this territory before we get to some kind of negotiated settlement?
No, I mean, I think I would phrase it a little differently and say that right now the Russians are asking for parts of territory that they don't actually have under their control. They have made tremendous advances in all of those regions, but they don't completely control, for example, all of Donetsk. And I would expect actually this summer offensive rather, would probably focus a lot on trying to capture the rest of Donetsk. But I think that's part of the issue, is that where you don't have actually forces that are controlling territory, that Ukrainians are signaling, we're not prepared to hand you more territory. And so I think that's really one of the key areas of dispute right now, is exactly where the territorial lines will be. And I, there's a danger here, I think, that Putin's actually overplaying his hand, and that, instead of being willing to compromise of the territory that he's holding and go to a peace deal, he seems to want all control of all of these 5 territories. And I think the question will be whether he's able to accomplish that on the battlefield this summer. And if not, if he'll finally concede that it's not worth the continued cost of fighting and that he's had enough. He's satisfied with what he has.
Mm-hmm. President Trump's been talking a lot about Iran this week. Kelly Grieco, first it was word of an olive branch, as he put it, news of a written proposal for a nuclear deal that went to Tehran today. On Truth Social, he writes, they have a proposal. More importantly, they know they have to move quickly or something bad is going to happen, he wrote. That's a direct quote, which apparently caused a great deal of confusion in Tehran. I'd like to ask you about the battle plan that he's referring to. What exactly would we do to move against Iran militarily? Would it be bunker-busting bombs to go after nuclear facilities, or more than that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not entirely clear what, the military plan would be. I would say, though, that we have been building up forces in the region, including bomber deployments in particular, including the type of bombers that can carry those really large bunker busting bombs. I think that buildup of bombers does have some kind of latent course of threat that potentially we would strike facilities in Iran. Of course, that would be a major escalation. And, the real risk then is that we'd end up in some kind of regional war. The other possibility is that we'd be willing to sign off on something, including possibly supplying the Israelis with some capabilities they might need to conduct some kinds of strikes against Iran. But, I think it's clear he's trying to use this sort of as a latent threat to create some pressure for negotiations, which is sort of what you do with these kinds of negotiations. But I would just say it's interesting to see that the Iranians seem at least somewhat receptive to trying to find a deal.
Well, the Iranian foreign minister, in response to the suggestion from President Trump that they should have something in hand, said on X today, Iran has not received any written proposal from the United States, whether directly or indirectly. He goes on to say, Kelly, in the meantime, the messaging we and the world continue to receive is confusing and contradictory. If it is indeed confusing, do you see the circumstances taking shape in which Iran is going to be willing to agree to something specific from the United States, or do those specifics still have much work to do to be ironed out?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear the specifics have much work to do to be ironed out. I think what we're getting at is actually something that we're seeing similarly with the Ukraine attempts at Ukraine peace deal, which is that President Trump very much sees diplomacy and making these sort of deals about interaction with himself, with another leader, where traditionally diplomacy, these kinds of really hard to get deals, there's a lot of groundwork that's laid before the leaders even meet to try to iron out all the details to find compromise and really pave the way for the leaders to essentially, at that point, agree to the terms. He tends to not do as much of the former and focuses more on the latter. And so I think we're seeing some of this play out with the Iranians as well, in that they're accustomed to that process where you work this out at a lower level and iron out terms, and not sort of Trump's more very direct, often even public approach. And I can understand why it creates confusion. This is, I think, one of the risks inherent with his approach to diplomacy.
Always great to have you with us, Kelly. She is with the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy. Kelly Grieco, great to have you with us, as always, on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz, where we're also seeking answers to exactly what happens to the president's tax and spend bill. Kailey, it didn't pass the Budget Committee, and we'll be joined on the late edition of Balance of Power by the Congressman from Tennessee, the Republican in the middle of all of this. Tim Burchett will join us here on Balance of Power.
Yeah, so hopefully we can get some answers from him. In the meantime, more coverage is ahead here on Bloomberg Business Week Daily. We'll see you at 5 on Bloomberg TV and radio.